finished.
Every time I hear that song, a wave of nostalgia comes rushing over me. It takes me back to a simpler time. The time when I would pull up a chair to our 12-inch TV and turn the channel to Nickelodeon while making bread chip sandwiches. Lay's chips on potato bread? Yeah, that was the best. The show was called Hey Arnold and ran from 1996 to 2004 on Nickelodeon. Created by Craig Bartlett, the show followed a fourth grader named Arnold and was based around his experiences while living in the city. Many of the episodes ranged from funny to being pretty sad. For example, the episode Parents' Day, we learned the reason why Arnold was left with his grandparents and the reason his parents actually left. I always was a big fan of this show, and I finally decided I wanted to do a sculpt of Arnold. But I wanted to make it a little bit different. Back in college, one thing we used to do in my figure drawing classes was we were assigned a fictional character. We were then supposed to draw what we thought the skeletal structure and the muscular structure would look like underneath. It was an enjoyable project, and at the end you had this cool-looking anatomical character where you could literally see what the character was made of. With the interesting shape that Arnold is, I thought it would be really awesome to do that for this project. And as a 3D model, I eventually want to print and cast this. And it will pose some interesting challenges, as I've only ever done a few casts in my life. The other difficulty is that I want the printed skeleton to be cast inside of a clear Arnold silhouette. When getting my reference, I was trying to decide on what pose I wanted Arnold to be in. I decided to go with the hand-on-knee pose from the show opening. I picked this pose because I thought it would be fun to make a series of the characters eventually, all from the pose in the opening. Sometimes I like to think way too big. After I decide the pose, I then start blocking it out, which is what you're watching now. I work in what's called a T-pose. This makes it much easier and quicker to block out the character since I can turn on symmetry and work on two sides at once. Every now and then you might see a rectangular block near Arnold's head. Since I know I will be cutting this in half, I use it as a visual aid. It helps me see where the line of symmetry is and also where the seam line will be. It's also useful to see the seam line on any asymmetrical parts, such as where his shirt comes out under the sweater. After Arnold is all fleshed out, I start working on the skeleton. Making the skull was pretty interesting. Arnold is known for his iconic football-shaped head, so trying to warp a human skull to the shape of a football was pretty nightmarish. His eye sockets were almost underneath his upper jaw. If the eye sockets on a normal human head were moved almost under your upper jaw, it might look something like this. The rest of the body wasn't nearly as exaggerated. While I was making the skeleton, I played with the idea of making the muscles as well. In the end, I just ended up sticking to the skeleton while also adding the organs in. This was a good compromise because I was able to fill in a lot of the hollow space, as well as strengthening up the chest so it doesn't break during printing. The arm bones and the leg bones are going to be super thin when I print them, but it's a little bit easier to glue an arm or a leg back on, rather than having to glue the entire rib cage or spine together. I made the intestines first, since they were the organs I was looking forward to making the most. All I did was use Z-spheres and squiggle it back and forth in the shape of intestines. I made sure to cover the back too, because I didn't want any internal geometry when printing. For anyone that doesn't know, internal geometry is when you don't properly close up dynameshed geometry, leaving you with either an unwanted hollow space or unwanted geometry inside your piece. Originally, when starting this project, my plan for posing the character would be combining the exterior model and the skeleton together and then go about posing. The problem I ran into when thinking about doing this was that the bones would end up being way too stretched and warped. I wanted to keep it more towards the realistic aspect, so I ended up posing the exterior first. As you can see in the video, posing can require a lot of pushing and pulling of material if you start from the T-pose, so it makes much more sense to pose the bones after instead of having to fix warping if I were to combine all the pieces. The other tricky part I faced when posing the skeletal structure were bones popping out of the model. As I pose the exterior, some parts of the model become thinner and narrower. This causes the bones to peek out, which would be no good, especially if I'm going to be casting the skeleton in a resin body. All this requires is a bit more finagling with the exterior, pushing and pulling the exterior geometry so that the skeleton sits inside of it properly. For Arnold, I'll be sticking with the regular colors from the show. I also thought, since we will be able to see parts of his insides through the clear resin, to paint the actual cross-section of how we would see him if he were actually cut in half. A small detail, but I was excited about it nonetheless. And after all that, we are done. a shrine to Arnold even Helga would fall in love with. I am pretty excited with how this project came out. One thing I realized after I finished was that I will most likely have to resculpt his hair. When thinking about actually producing that part as a resin piece, I found a few issues that will be a bit challenging to fix. So stay tuned for the future video where I go over 3D printing, casting, and creating this X-ray Arnold as an actual statue. If there is a prop, character, or just about anything you want to see me create, let me know in the comments below. That's all I have for this video. If you enjoy the projects I create, please let me know by liking the video. If you'd like to see me creating more figures and props, consider subscribing. Thanks for stopping by. Banehorse, signing off.